Welcome everyone this morning to November's webinar. We're going to be discussing floodways. What exactly is a stream encroachment, and can anyone ever obtain a no-rise certification? One of the blessings and curses of the job is that Julius and I and Cheyenne kind of have a front row seat to see things that are working well with floodplain management here in Tennessee, and some things that can sometimes be a struggle for local officials. So we're going to get into this today. So make sure in the chat box that you type in your first and last name, as well as a community or organization that you represent. A lot of you I know, some of you I don't. So if you're calling in, you want to make sure that you send an email to Cheyenne. Her email address is here, c.cheyenne.johnson@tn.gov. And again, if we don't have your information, or let's say it's just a random telephone number, you will not receive credit for participating in the training today. If you have questions, comments, concerns, you can type them in the chat box. Julius and Young will be monitoring that as we go along. And then as we begin to have a new year in 2023, we are going to be offering webinars every month once again. So if there's certain ideas that you have or topics that you would like to have a training, please email Cheyenne. You can email myself. It is a volunteer state, so I would like some of you guys to volunteer some ideas. We may have ideas for webinars, but since you're our customer, since you're our audience, some of you may have ideas of trainings that you would like to see. So don't be bashful and just let us know what you would like to see in the future. So we're going to talk about some definitions from the National Flood Insurance Program as far as stream encroachments, what's a floodplain, what's a floodway. We're going to be talking about other regulations. I've gone out and done a couple community assistance visits, as I affectionately call audits. And when I ask communities about various types of permits and things that they should be obtaining for various types of development, I was told last week by the entire staff that they didn't know what I was talking about. So we're going to go through some of those other regulations. We're going to talk about local responsibilities. As a local floodplain administrator, when someone is proposing development, what you should be looking for, what you should be requiring for documentation, and what should happen before there's something that's encroaching a stream, whether it's mapped or unmapped. And then also for the engineers that are on the session today, we're going to talk about the no-rise checklist. A lot of times when we're getting submittals, there's a lot of holes. There's a lot of missing pieces and parts for the submittal. So we're going to go through the sample checklist that Yang has as far as what should be submitted. And then we'll also kind of talk about some other, we'll show you guys an example of when an engineer didn't necessarily go through this office to submit a conditional letter of map revision. It was sent to FEMA, and the 4 pages single spaced of all the missing pieces and parts, unfortunately, that wasn't in the submittal. So we'll kind of go through all this. We'll have a time of questions. So it should be another awesome session. Okay, National Flood Insurance Program definitions. Every program has the definitions for different terms. So the definition of development is the same in Tennessee as it would be in Texas, as it would be in California. So everybody's speaking the same language. So we're going to talk about floodplain, exactly how the National Flood Insurance Program, FEMA, defines what is a floodplain, what is a special flood hazard area. One time I did have someone ask me what was special about a special flood hazard area. Exactly how FEMA defines a regulatory floodway and encroachments. What types of development is going to trigger an engineering analysis. So we're going to go through these definitions here for section 1. So the definition of floodplain is any land area that's susceptible to being inundated by water from any source. So sometimes you have, some communities have topography issues where the low-lying areas are susceptible to flooding. Sometimes you have areas where there's a lot of subdivisions and there's stormwater when there's a rain event, that can inundate land. Sometimes when there's folks that are purchasing a home in a subdivision, we like to call it the bottom of the cereal bowl, that they pick the lowest lot in the subdivision and water just naturally accumulates during a rain event. So it's any land that's susceptible to being inundated by floodwater. So the definition for a special flood hazard area is the land in the floodplain within a community that's subject to a 1% or greater chance of flooding in any given year. So before, FEMA would always say, you know, you're in the 100-year flood event. So folks would say, okay, if I'm living in this area, I only have a once in a 100-year probability of having a flood event. So FEMA has kind of migrated over to saying it's a 1% or greater chance of flooding in any given year. And so the area may be designated as Zone A on a flood hazard boundary map that was historical. And then as FEMA has detailed flood maps, they have various zones to include Zone A, where you don't have any detailed elevation information. You can have Zone AO that has shallow ponding, which is what, 1 to 3 feet or less, but doesn't have any base flood elevation information. You can have Zone AH, where base flood elevations are on a flood insurance rate map. You can have Zone AE, like you see below in the map, or A99 that's protected from a levee. So those are kind of the special flood hazard areas that we see predominantly in Tennessee. So fun fact for the day, that you can say that there's no coastal V zones in Tennessee. The definition of a regulatory floodway is a channel of a river or other water course and the adjacent land areas that must be reserved in order to discharge a base flood without cumulatively increasing the water surface elevation more than a designated height. So we really like this picture here because it really gives a good visual example. If you have a stream in your community, the area along the stream really should be reserved so that if there is a flood event, that discharge of the base flood waters can go into the adjacent land area and flood without necessarily harming human life or having business interruptions. This is the highest potential for flooding, the highest risk in the community. So you really should have areas where it's free of any kind of encroachment, where floodwaters could damage a bridge, a structure, different things. So a lot of times, since I've been in this job, one of my favorite memories, one time I went to a community because there was a property owner that had a barber shop that did not like the fact that his barber shop was within a regulatory floodway. So went to a meeting. He was very upset. So let him speak. The newspaper reporter was there. There was a camera person, photographer. And so he went outside of the barber shop and he said, I think the floodway line should stop right here. And he pointed to the ground, just arbitrarily just pointed a spot and said, I think it should stop right here. Well, of course, his building was behind him, so it would have been out. So a lot of times you have people that say, I don't understand how flood insurance rate maps are developed. FEMA is just being, I want to say, aggressive in floodplain mapping. The federal government is wrong. And so a lot of times there's homeowners that think that when flood insurance rate maps are developed, it's just arbitrary and capricious in how it is developed. But y'all could probably sit here for hours and say that there's a whole method of the madness when it comes to developing a special flood hazard area. So one of the things is when a community is getting a new flood insurance rate maps, or there's a new watershed study going out, one of the first things that the mapping contractor for the state of Tennessee is going to do is going to go out and have surveyors survey the area to see what captures a special flood hazard area. What is that low-lying area that's susceptible to the 1% chance of flooding? So as you can see here from the schematic, typically there's a stream channel. Typically FEMA will map streams that are 1 square mile or greater drainage. It costs $100,000 a stream mile to be studied. So a lot of times we have communities that'll say, hey, Amy, we want to have new flood insurance rate maps, but they don't necessarily understand the cost and everything that goes into it to have new maps developed in an area. Or let's say Metro Nashville, when they had new maps coming out, some of the residents were surprised to see that it was an unmapped area and now it's mapped, and it was impacting whether or not they had to have flood insurance. So essentially, you have the special flood hazard area, you have in the center here, you have the stream channel, and then you have the floodway fringe. So what FEMA does in order to determine the floodway is to hypothetically simulate an encroachment. So they bring fill in, and essentially it's squeezing that stream channel so that the water surface elevation, the surcharge, can go up to 1 foot. That's considered the floodway area. And then when it's 1 foot or less, it's considered the floodway fringe, or what you guys also know as the floodplain. So you can see here that line A and B is a flood elevation before the encroachment. And then you can see line C and D is a flood elevation after the encroachment. So there is scientific methodology that's used to make sure that the floodway is defined on the flood insurance rate maps. The surcharge per FEMA's requirements is that it cannot exceed more than 1 foot. So a lot of times people go, okay, Amy, a landowner is proposing to bring in fill, new construction, other development that's encroaching a stream. So it's any kind of activity or construction within the floodway. So a lot of times people think about fill. Let's say that I'm building a home and I'm putting fill on a lot, and let's say there's an unmapped stream, and my dump truck driver, let's say my surveyor puts out stakes on the property to say, okay, you can't go beyond this line or else you're getting in a floodway. And let's say that my friend is bringing in the truck, is backing up, they're new, maybe they hit the gas and they accidentally hit one of those stakes and they put fill across that line. That's one of our biggest potential violations in Tennessee, is that people are putting fill in a floodway area. They're submitting a letter of map revision based upon fill to FEMA, and then all of a sudden we get a potential violation letter, Julius and I, to say, hey, I'll say Worcester, Tennessee, make something up. Worcester, Tennessee, there's this property where they put fill in the floodway, and then we have to work with the property owner to remedy that situation and bring it into compliance to the fullest extent possible. So whether it's fill, whether it's new construction, whether it's a bridge, whether it's a structure, whether it's a pedestrian path, if it's a substantial improvement or other development, let's say that you're putting riprap along a stream bank, any of those type of activities are going to trigger an engineering analysis. So these activities are prohibited within an adopted regulatory floodway unless it's been demonstrated through hydrologic and hydraulic analysis that the proposed encroachment would not result in any increase in flood levels. So I think the biggest thing when people read this, they don't necessarily understand. They think, okay, it's prohibited, I can't do it at all. That's not the case. It's prohibited unless there's been an engineering analysis that's been done, that's been reviewed for compliance, meets the standards based upon the type of stream on a flood insurance rate map, the type of stream standards or encroachment standards within your flood damage prevention regulations. All these things have to be done first before the development occurs. So essentially, as I tell people all the time, you have to ask for permission. Permission is much more easier, much less, give you a little bit less headaches than trying to go back and ask for forgiveness. That's much harder. So the community is responsible to review and maintain record of the documentation demonstrating that any permitted floodway encroachment meets the NFIP requirements. One of the things that I've seen since I've been here is that most local officials do not read their regulations, or they read the regulations and they're unsure exactly what it means. And essentially, with FEMA having this requirement, the communities have to review and make sure that it's compliant. In many communities across Tennessee and across the nation, it's really an unfunded mandate. They're requiring you to do a certain analysis, but if you don't have an engineer on staff, it makes it very difficult when someone gives you, let's say, a 300-page document and there's all these charts, graphs, different things. If you're sitting there looking at it, if you're a floodplain administrator, you don't know what you're looking at. So it makes it very difficult. So that's why TEMA, my office, started doing in-house reviews, is because when I would go out and do an audit, I would see development that was encroaching a stream. I would ask the floodplain administrator, hey, what do you have? What documentation do you have? And I could sit there, and what was it, probably 5, 6 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, could sit there and look at it. I knew it wasn't right, but I didn't know why it wasn't right. So through time and through just having probably over 100 meetings with Young and learning the standards, again, having all the pieces and parts to really capture whether or not it's going to increase flooding at any point within the community and not just site specific, having all the hydraulic models, I've learned a lot. So that's why we do these trainings, is to try to equip you so that your confidence and your comfortability will increase when you're having an encroachment along a stream. So if there's any questions or comments, we'll put it in the chat function. I know Julius will kind of take the wheel with that. And then when we get done, we'll go through questions at the end, I think, just for the sake of time. So the National Flood Insurance Program, the Code of Federal Regulations has standards for stream encroachments, what triggers updating the flood insurance rate maps, a flood insurance study. And then there's other state and federal requirements that should be done when there's development that's impacting a stream. So we're going to go through that here right now. So some of the things we're going to talk about is we're going to highlight some of the regulations that are in the Code of Federal Regulations that are in parts 59, 60, 65, and 70. We'll also talk about Executive Order 11988, that communities should sit down and look at a proposed development to see how it's going to impact the floodplain and if there's other alternatives to where the proposed development is going to be happening. We'll also go over the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. We'll also go through Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. We'll also go through Section 401 of the ARAP permit, the Aquatic Resource Alteration permit, and then we'll also talk about the regulations for encroachments of the various streams. So when we think about the National Flood Insurance Program, you guys would probably giggle if you came into my office, because right by my desk telephone is I have a Code of Federal Regulations book right by the phone. So when I've had different bosses through my time in different agencies, I had one that would always laugh at me and say, Amy, you never leave home without it. You always have it by your phone. So there is kind of, in life, okay, let's say some of you guys were to bake like I do. If I'm going to bake, let's say I'm going to make Ina Garten cinnamon donuts. If I'm going to bake the donuts, I know the recipe a little bit, but I don't necessarily know it by heart. So I always pull out the recipe book to make sure that I preheat my oven, that I have the correct ingredients and measurements, and I make sure that I do it as it is supposed to be. The same sort of thing can be thought of with the Code of Federal Regulations. There's different definitions. There's different prerequisites that the local community is supposed to undertake when they voluntarily participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. Keep in mind that these links here on the screen, that when you guys want to look at it later, if you wanted to see what the Code of Federal Regulations look like, you can click on this right here and it'll pull it up. So the meat and potatoes of the National Flood Insurance Program for local participating communities are the requirements for floodplain management regulations. So exactly, if I'm a floodplain administrator, or let's say that it was my twin sister and you said, Jen, what do you do as a floodplain administrator? Maybe she would know, maybe she wouldn't know. Julius and I have had the opportunity to work with many local communities where you have a new floodplain administrator. And one of the first things we do is encourage them to look at their flood damage prevention regulations. We had a webinar back in September for the floodplain management permitting guide. That is a tremendous resource for every single person on this call. If you want to know exactly what communities in Tennessee should be doing, we have all the standards written out. So as a floodplain administrator, the National Flood Insurance Program is kind of like a quid pro quo. If a community has a resolution of intent, they adopt flood damage prevention regulations agreeing to enforcing all the various standards that are within there that are within 60.3, then the community has the availability of having flood insurance and disaster assistance if there's a flood event, God forbid. So again, there's various standards. If you guys have never ever sat down and read your flood damage prevention regulations, I encourage you to do it. If you don't have time to necessarily read the whole document, if you look at the floodplain management permitting guide as a courtesy, when Julius was here in June, we sat down and kind of went through all the various standards and listed through everything. So Team Jack, Julius, Amy, and Cheyenne, we went through the whole thing to write that up to make sure that you have it so that there's an administrative procedure. Because a lot of times when you're trying to tackle floodplain management, you can look at the regulations and then go, okay, where do I start? Where do I begin? So that permitting playbook is phenomenal. Make sure you use it. Because again, if you can't necessarily get me or get Julius right away, you do have an administrative procedure within that document to help you kind of take baby steps in learning the program. Now, one thing that we hear a lot of times when it comes to floodway development, stream encroachments, that we have a lot of times with calls with unhappy individuals is they always ask, can I get a variance? I don't want to pay to do a flood study. Or an engineering analysis. I don't want to have to wait 12 to 18 months. This is unfair. Life is unfair. You just hear a lot of frustration with that. So variances shall not be issued by a community within any designated regulatory floodway if any increase in flood levels during the base flood discharge would result. So please, please, please do not issue a variance. Now, some people say, well, I have a hardship, but economic hardship is not an allowable variance. So part 65 talks about identification and mapping of special flood hazard areas. 65.12 really highlights the fact that if there's any kind of changes to the base flood elevation caused by proposed encroachments, that the applicant is required to submit those proposed changes to FEMA through the 65.12. So again, when a community proposes to permit encroachments within the floodplain and there's a regulatory floodway has not been adopted, or to permit encroachments upon an adopted. So again, if you have zone AE with a floodway, if you have a zone AE without a floodway, or if you have zone A streams, whether or not it's defined, whether or not that floodway is defined, if there's anything that's going to cause the base flood elevation to increase in excess of those permitted under paragraphs C10 D3 of section 60.3, they have to apply to FEMA for conditional approval of such action prior to permitting the encroachment to occur. So again, this is a standard that a lot of people don't necessarily like because they say, okay, there's going to be changes, there's going to be increases. I don't want to pay to do this. This is very expensive. It's going to, there's a 90-day application window that once an engineer submits it to FEMA, if they're missing various pieces and parts, FEMA goes and they stop the process. They ask the engineer to resubmit additional information, and then that 90 days starts again. but this is a requirement. This isn't something that I came up with. It isn't something that Julia's come up with. It isn't something that y'all came up with. It is a federal standard. If there are any kind of increases, that you submit it to FEMA so that they make sure that it falls within the standards and that you have approval. Again, getting permission before the development occurs. So there's additional here about requesting a conditional approval of map change. There's a fee. And then there's also an evaluation of alternatives, which would not result in the base flood elevation increasing. Making sure that the engineer has given documentation of to individuals that have a legal notice, so that all property owners within and outside the community explaining the proposed action on their property. So one time we had a development in East Tennessee, and the engineer actually sent letters to everyone so that they knew. I think like one property owner had a 2-inch rise. So again, there's a concurrence from the chief executive officer, and then certification that no structures are located in areas which would be impacted by the increased base flood elevation. So again, there's additional information here where you're requesting a revision for the base flood elevation determination. If there's a floodway revision where, let's say, maybe the floodway is going to increase or decrease in an area, you're going to be submitting that. If it's going to increase, then there's a receipt that gives communities a case number so that you know you have that documentation. And then upon completion of the proposed encroachment, the community is going to have the engineer submit a letter of map revision. So you're going to provide as-built certifications in accordance with the provisions of this part. So again, the Federal Insurance Administrator is going to initiate a final map revision upon receipt of all certifications in accordance with Part 67 of the subchapter. So that was for regulatory floodways where they're designated Zone AE with the floodways. So then you go, okay, Amy, what about some of these other streams? So FEMA kind of does a flip side where you kind of have the have and the have-nots. So this is kind of the have-not section where if you do not have a regulatory floodway designated, no new construction, substantial improvements, or other development, including fill, shall be permitted within Zone AE without a floodway or Zone A unless it has been demonstrated that the cumulative effect of the proposed development, when combined with all other existing and anticipated development, will not increase the water surface elevation of the base flood more than 1 foot at any point within the community. So the reason why we have this highlighted in red is a lot of times we have engineers or we have property owners that say, I just want to see what the impact of, let's say, this little bridge here in the picture. I only want to study at my project site. I don't care about the impact anywhere else in the community. Or let's say you have an applicant that says, I don't want to have to tie in 2 or 3 miles down from my site to a detailed study to see what the impact is going to be at any point within the community. That's one thing that we've kind of struggled with, is when there's not a detailed study and it's a Zone A or unmapped stream, you have to tie it into where there's already a detailed study so that you compare apples to apples and it's not just for the project site. So this is just additional information for Zone AE with floodway. This is very similar to what is within the flood damage prevention regulations, talking about prohibiting encroachments, fill, new construction, substantial improvements, other development within the adopted regulatory floodway. As I talked about a moment ago, there has to be an engineering analysis that is not going to increase flood levels within the community during the occurrence of the base discharge. And then if there are going to be increases for number 4, they have to submit a conditional letter of map revision with a citation of 65.12. Now, another one that's been fun, there's one floodplain administrator that has this issue where there's unmapped streams. So the state of Tennessee has higher regulatory standards for unmapped streams, that there has to be an engineering analysis done. It can have up to a 1 foot rise. But FEMA does allow communities to have the standard through 65.12 that a community or an individual through the community may request FEMA's comment on whether a proposed project, if built as proposed, would justify a map revision. So sometimes we have landowners that say, hey, I have an unmapped stream. This is a higher regulatory standard. Why do I have to do this? So if you have a property owner that is developing within an unmapped stream, you want to make sure that you know the citation. Another thing too is that once this presentation is done, please, if someone has a question, this is probably the third engineering analysis presentation that we've done for floodway stream encroachments. If someone is unfamiliar with these standards, please refer them to the YouTube channel to watch these videos just to get more information. Because sometimes if I wasn't in my position and it was just plain old Amy Miller and she had to talk about this, it's a lot of jargon, right? It's a lot of stuff that you're not going to hear in your everyday life. But the fact that we have these webinars online that you can watch anytime, day or night, if you have insomnia, or if you just want to relive the magic that is these webinars, you can do that. But again, this is a requirement that if there are any kind of revisions, that they have to do a conditional letter of map revision prior to development. And then once it's done, submit a letter of map revision so that the maps can be revised. One thing that's beneficial for this is that if you have an unmapped stream and someone does a detailed study and they submit a conditional letter of map revision, they can have the flood insurance rate maps revised, the flood insurance study to have detailed information. So if you're in a community where there's a lot of development that's occurring, if you take that unmapped stream and it ties into a detailed study, if you have to go 2 or 3 miles, you can get that area revised on your flood insurance rate map and have more detailed information if you have future development coming in that area to try to protect citizens that are building residential structures, or for business owners that they don't have business interruptions, that they have a more detailed and accurate evaluation and representation of their flood risk in the community. This is Federal Executive Order 11988. For those of you that ever want to study for your Certified Floodplain Manager designation, the biggest thing here is when you're looking at a development proposal, you really want to try to make sure that you reduce flood losses, either through the environment, served by floodplains, and then avoiding actions located in or adversely affecting floodplains, unless there's no practicable alternative. So sometimes when I read this one, I think about, let's say that you're going to have a school being sited in your community. Is it in a floodplain? Is it near a floodway? And maybe revising the site plan to move that structure, that development outside the floodway, or get it beyond the stream so that it's not so highly susceptible to flooding. And making sure that you take action to mitigate losses if avoidance is not practicable. So for instance, last night I was looking at a commercial structure in a community that had crawl space. It was 7,285 square feet. It didn't have any flood vents. So talking about mitigating losses and hoping to reduce the flood insurance cost for that structure, as far as recommending that they put in flood openings or foundation openings to equalize the hydrostatic pressure. And then it does establish a process for flood hazard evaluation based upon the 100-year flood standard of the NFIP. And then it also directs the agencies, federal agencies, to impose or issue implementing procedures, a consultation mechanism for developing and implementing procedures, and making sure that there's oversight mechanisms. So sometimes in your community, people think, a development's a really good idea, but it's in an area where it's really susceptible to flooding. This kind of gives you the opportunity to sit down and say, if it's a critical facility, is this necessarily in the best area? Or looking at a site plan to make sure, let's say that I have a drive or a road to get back to my facility. If it's below the base flood elevation, talking about mitigation actions to bring that road up to the base flood elevation so that's not so susceptible to flooding, so that my emergency management personnel doesn't have to go out and do a rescue every time there's a flash flood in the community. So we have the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, the NPDES permit. TDEC is a designated agency. So if a person is discharging pollutants directly from point sources into surface waters of the state, they have to obtain an NPDES discharge permit from the Division of Water Resources. And then they direct dischargers to include industrial, commercial, wastewater, industrial stormwater, municipal wastewater discharges, if there's mining facilities that are class 1, or a CAFO, a concentrated animal feeding operation, is also going to require a discharge permits. The reason why I'm putting this in here is that sometimes you guys have various say utilities, facilities that are doing this sort of thing that, you know, everybody's kind of siloed, right? Because maybe I go get Army Corps of Engineers permit, maybe I go get a TDEC permit, but I don't think about the National Flood Insurance Program. What am I supposed to be doing? So again, we're just trying to equip you in your toolbox that if someone is discharging into the waters, to make sure that they have this permit, to use this as a resource for future development in your community. So Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, the Army Corps of Engineers is a designated agency for waters of the United States, and they really want to make sure that they restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the waters of the United States. And again, you are required to obtain a permit from the Regulatory Division for the discharge of dredged or fill material in any water of the United States. So again, if there's any kind of fill, if there's any kind of dredging, sometimes local communities will say, hey, I want to dredge a stream. Again, it has to be engineered, and you have to get a Section 404 permit and do an engineering analysis. So we also have Section 401 permits, which is the ARAP permit. It's the Aquatic Resource Alteration Permit. TDEC is a Division of Water Resources, is a designated agency. So persons who wish to make an alteration to a stream, river, lake, or wetland first have to obtain a water quality permit, and then any kind of physical alterations to the properties of waters of the state require the ARAP permit or a 401 water quality certification. So if there's any kind of dredging, excavation, channel widening, or straightening, has to get one of these permits. And we'll also talk in a moment about what the NFIP requirements are, especially when there's a stream alteration. If there's any kind of bank sloping, stabilization, channel relocation, water diversions or withdrawals, if there's a dam, a weir, a dike, a levee, or other similar structures, if there's any kind of flooding, excavating, draining, and or filling of a wetland, if there's road and utility crossings or structural fill. So you can kind of see that some of the other agencies are requiring permits. So you want to make sure that if someone is doing this, that they're doing a project that has any of these types of activities, that they are getting a 401 permit. So one of my goals next year is to kind of go through some of these and kind of get a toolkit for you guys, that if there's certain types of stream encroachments, that certain permits are getting done. Because if you look at the flood damage prevention regulations, it'll say, do you have state and federal permits? And when I come in, I ask people that, they always go, yeah, but I don't always get the feeling that people know exactly what I'm talking about. So we want to make sure that you guys have more detailed information to make sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. So again, stream alterations in the flood damage prevention regulations that every participating community has, talks about making sure that all necessary permits have been received by those governmental agencies. And then there is going to be any kind of alteration or relocation of a water course. The affected communities need to be letting me know, as well as notifying adjacent communities prior to any kind of relocation, and then submitting that notification to FEMA. And then within 6 months of project completion of the altered or relocated water course, that documentation has to be submitted to FEMA through a letter of map revision process. This is one thing that we as statewide has not done a good job, there have been various types of projects where there has been an alteration or relocation and has not been submitted to FEMA as a letter of map revision. So we want to start being a little bit more diligent, because if you're a homeowner and the stream is being relocated, if the maps aren't getting revised, homeowners are still going to be required to pay for flood insurance because the maps don't accurately reflect on the ground conditions. So again, and then if it's relocated to an area where a homeowner should be having flood insurance to try to protect their business or home, those maps should be revised. So again, and then also making sure that the flood carrying capacity within an altered or relocation portion of any water course is maintained. These are the requirements for Zone AE with floodways. So if we were to open up your flood damage prevention regulations today and you go, okay, Amy, where is it at? This is the exact text of the statewide model. So again, number one is very similar to 44 CFR section 60.3 D3, talking about encroachments are prohibited, including fill, new construction, substantial improvements, or other development within an adopted regulatory floodway unless there's been a hydraulic and hydrologic analysis performed with standard engineering practice, and it's not going to result in any increase in the base flood levels, floodway widths during a base flood discharge. So again, professional engineer has to provide supporting technical data. Again, it has to be done prior to development. Again, you're going to be asking for permission. And then if there are any kind of increases or changes to the base flood elevations, floodway widths, or base flood discharge, the applicant has to submit a conditional letter of map revision to fulfill the standards in 65.12. For Zone AE without floodways, until a regulatory floodway is designated, no new construction, substantial or other development, including fill, shall be permitted within Zone AE on the community's firm unless it's been demonstrated through hydrologic and hydraulic analysis performed that the cumulative effect of the proposed development, when you combine all other existing and anticipated development, shall not increase the water surface elevation of the base flood more than 1 foot at any point within the community. So the community can permit the encroachment if it's within that standard. And if it does result in an increase in the water surface elevation of the base flood, provided the applicant first applies for conditional letter of map revision and floodway revision to fulfill 65.12. So we do ask for that because then you can revise the maps to show the accurate and up-to-date flood risk in a community. For Zone A streams, this one is a little bit harder for some people because if you have a Zone A stream, there's no base flood elevation information established. So the applicant is going to have to hire a surveyor to delineate. Well, let's go back. So the applicant is going to have to hire a surveyor, and one of the first things the surveyor is going to have to do is measure the width of the stream from top of stream bank, right? So if someone is proposing something in a Zone A stream, but they're within an area equal to the width of the stream or 20 feet, whichever is greater, measure from the top of the stream bank, they don't have to do an engineering analysis. However, if they're within that buffer area that's equal to the width of the stream or 20 feet, so if they're building a bridge that's crossing a Zone A stream that's within that buffer, they're going to have to hire a registered professional engineer to provide engineering analysis of the cumulative effect of the proposed development combined with all other existing and anticipated development will not increase the water surface elevation of the base flood more than 1 foot within the community. So that's one thing that it kind of has, when you start to get into some of these other streams, there's not a HEC-RAS model. So HEC-RAS model is really that representation we saw earlier of how FEMA captures floodways and floodplain in a community, has a detailed analysis. So if there's streams like Zone AE without a floodway and there's no FEMA model, Zone A streams do not have a FEMA model. There's more things that a property owner is going to have to do to try to get an engineering analysis to evaluate the base flood discharge, the floodway widths, and the base flood elevation. And they're going to have to hire a surveyor to delineate where that regulatory floodway would be along that stream. If they're doing something outside that buffer, they have to give you as a floodplain administrator a site plan showing in that development is outside that stream buffer. Again, I don't think that's hard to ask for. I don't think that's asking a lot. For some people, it seems to be. But again, if you're a floodplain administrator and you're trying to make a determination and trying to make sure that development is compliant, you want to make sure that you have that documentation on the site plan and that it's very clear what the buffer is and if that proposed development is outside of it or if it's inside of it. You have to have that on the site plan. So unmapped streams, same sort of thing, that you're going to have to hire a surveyor to go out and have a site plan to show where the channel of the stream is to determine where that floodway area, where the water is going. And then an engineer is going to have to create an effective model. So again, you're going to have a baseline as far as the different flood events, the 10, 50, 100, 500 year events. Then they're going to do an existing conditions model to show what's existing within the area and then tie that into a detailed study, as well as the proposed conditions, what is being proposed at the site, looking at all that to see if you have up to a 1 foot increase of the water surface elevation at any point within the community. Again, if you're able to meet that threshold, there is a concurrence letter that can be written by me after Young reviews everything. So again, this is a higher standard. There's only a couple states in the nation that has this standard, but it is something that's in the model flood damage prevention regulations. It's been in there since at least 2009. So this isn't something new. This isn't something that I came up with, Young came up with, or Julius come up with. Is something that we've had from the beginning in Tennessee. So this is just kind of a nice schematic. Carrie Williamson at TVA one time sent us a picture drawn out talking about that the stream is 10 foot wide. What does this look like to have the buffers? So the stream needs to have a 50-foot buffer. You're going to have the 10-foot wide where the stream channel is, where the water flows, and then twice the width of the buffer on each side, which would be 20 feet. So sometimes people get a little bit, when you talk about these standards, sometimes people are visual learners. Some people can read the text and understand it, and some people got to see it. So we kind of have the best of both worlds, that if you're wondering what this looks like, this is a good schematic for that. Okay. So we're about almost halfway through the presentation, so we will continue on for local responsibilities. So as we always say during these webinars, that the star of the show for floodplain management is a local official. It is not me. It is not Julius. It's not Cheyenne. It's you guys. So whenever someone is coming in, they're proposing development, there's certain things that as a floodplain administrator, you guys should be doing. So as we talked about over and over and over again, the first thing is having a floodplain permit. Again, documenting any kind of man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate, right? And then having a site plan. So in your flood damage prevention regulations, you are required to have a site plan drawn in duplicate to scale, showing the nature, location, dimensions, elevations of the area in question, existing or proposed structures, placement of earth and fill, storage of material and equipment, and drainage facilities. One thing that I think needs to be done a little bit better statewide is that if someone's giving you a site plan, just don't take it as gospel. If they really should be downloading the national flood hazard layer on the site plan. We had a meeting yesterday with the community about a project of planting trees, and if it's within a regulatory floodway, the site plan didn't show that, but the national flood hazard layer did. So you want to make sure that if a surveyor just kind of arbitrarily draws like a little dotted line to say this is a floodplain, please verify. Looking at, if you guys really want to do just something quick, look at the Tennessee Property Viewer. If you want to get a little bit more in depth, look at the FEMA Map Service Center website. But ask the surveyors to download the National Flood Hazard Layer. It's a GIS layer. It's really easy to get for every community, but it should be on there. Because a lot of times you'll have an unmapped stream, and I'll look at a site plan, or someone will email me or call me and say, hey, Amy, can you look at this? I look at the site plan, and it doesn't say anything about a drainage facility. And then I look on the Tennessee Property Viewer, and there's an unmapped stream. So sometimes people say to me, Amy, I get these site plans. I'm super busy. I don't have time to go out and look at the site. It's very detrimental. You really should be going out, walking the site to look at it, whether it be you or whether it be a building inspector, planner, somebody should be going out to see if there's a drainage facility. Another thing that kind of can throw a little bit of a red flag is if the development proposal has a culvert or has any kind of stream crossing, that tells you that there should be an engineering analysis. So again, you want to look to see what's happening documentation wise, as well as going out looking at the site. So there's various types of stream encroachments. These are some of the different types of projects that we've seen through the years, whether there's fill, new construction, substantial improvements, bridges, culverts. I put fill on there twice. Woo! Excavation, alteration, relocation of a stream, water sewer lines. One of our favorites that we had a couple years ago, I'm sure y'all will giggle, we had an amusement park ride that was encroaching in a floodway or a riprap of a stream. One of the great things about Tennessee and floodplain management is we have a lot of documentation. When I first came into this job, there wasn't really a lot of how-to guides to help floodplain administrators. So over time, we have developed a lot of materials and resources for you guys to equip you to help you do your job a little bit better. So the Tennessee No-Rise Guidance Document gives an overview of the National Flood Insurance Program standards. On page 2 has the submittal guidelines. After page 2, there's discussions about the 5 different hydraulic models. What do they mean? Documentation requirements, additional considerations, what triggers an engineering analysis versus what does not if it's a small scale project. And then we also have the ordinance requirements. So we went through several slides back about Zone AE with floodways, Zone AE without floodways, Zone A streams, and unmapped streams. So we literally have copy and pasted the ordinance text to help y'all. So if somebody is proposing to do development along a stream, if you've never ever read that text or you're unfamiliar where it's at within your regulations, we have it in here. We've done the work for you. Again, everybody needs to read this prior to initiating a study because it kind of gives you all the pieces and parts to it. We're going to go through some of it today. You guys will see a little bit of my humor. You'll see Young's top 10 list of issues, but we're going to kind of go through some of the things. We're not going to get into everything because then the webinar would be several hours long and y'all would not be happy. First thing is whenever there's a stream encroachment, first thing the engineer should do is request a HEC-RAS model from the FEMA Engineering Library. So as we showed at the schematic at the beginning of how a floodway is developed, FEMA actually has models that they created for the flood insurance rate maps to show regulatory floodways. So an engineer will get this form. I'm just going to make some up. Let's say that I'm requesting Killbuck Creek and I want cross section A to cross section C. I'm going to request that through the data request form. I'm going to pay a fee, and the request can take 6 to 8 weeks for FEMA to process. The one thing that I would caution people is that Rome wasn't built in a day. And so whenever someone's requesting these models, I would love to have $1 for every time somebody requested it on a Friday, and then they send me an email on Tuesday saying, where's my model? It does say within the documentation it can take 6 to 8 weeks for FEMA to review the request and get you the information. So for the hydraulic models, I love this picture because in a couple weeks I'll be making this pie. One of the things that I think is awesome is that I went to school to be an elementary school teacher. So I always think about teaching. How do you break down a complicated topic in a way that people can understand? So for those of you that love this schematic, that love this pie example, when you think about engineering models, I could sit here and say, I could rattle off all 5 and you go, uh-huh. But if I do it in a way that you kind of understand, that kind of gets in your head a little bit, it's even better. So when you think about hydraulic models, it's kind of like making a pie. So you have what you would consider to be your pie plate, your 9-inch pie plate, your 10-inch pie plate. That is your effective model, right? That is kind of your foundation, because if you're going to bake a pie, you have to have it in a dish so that it doesn't go running all over the place. So that's your effective model. And then your duplicate effective model is an engineer is going to duplicate FEMA's effective model on their computer. So that would be your pie crust. You want it to be the same as your pie plate. Okay. So corrected effective is non-man-made changes. So essentially that would be preheating your oven to 350 degrees. So again, it's non-man-made changes. You're just heating up the oven. And then existing conditions would be your pie filling, whether you're making a pecan pie, whether you're making a pumpkin pie, what's existing. So the existing development within the study area. So if you're taking a piece of farmland and you're doing a bridge, but then you have to do various cross sections within the study. And let's say that the farm beside the flood insurance rate map showed a farm beside you, but now there's a 100 lot subdivision. For existing conditions, you're going to be putting what's existing along that studied stream area beyond the project site that you're tying into either a detailed study, or you're doing various cross sections. Like let's say you're doing cross section A to cross section C. What's existing within the study area? So again, that's your pie filling. And then proposed conditions, once you put that pie crust, pie filling in the oven and you bake it, let's say for an hour, are you going to get something? Is your pecan pie going to be runny? Is it going to be perfectly set when you open up the oven? Or did you put too much pie filling in and it comes up over and burns the cookie sheet or burns the bottom of your oven, right? So you have to have all 5 of these models. You have to have effective, duplicate effective, corrected effective, existing and conditions, or a proposed conditions model. You have to have all 5 of those. And once you input all the various pieces and parts, if you can achieve a 0.00, that's a no rise. If there's any kind of increases in the model, then you have to submit a conditional letter of map revision. So same sort of thing with the pie. So one of the key points when you're doing an engineering analysis, or when an engineer is submitting a report to you, is to have a project narrative. You want to know the who, what, where, when, why. So if anybody were to ever pick up the engineering report or engineering analysis, someone should be able to open it up and say that I'm in Wayne County, Tennessee. I'm on, let's say, Burbank Road. I'm proposing a bridge crossing on, let's say, parcel 4, lot 25 or whatever, and it's going across Killbuck Creek. So someone should be able to pick it up and understand what you're proposing to do. Let's say I'm just doing a steel bridge across there, and different things and the abutments and all that. But somebody should be able to pick up that project narrative and be able to understand where you're proposing the development, what you're doing, and what type of stream it is. So making sure that you have the flood insurance rate map and all that information is important. So topographic work map shows the floodplain and floodway limits. It shows the topography, locations and labels on effective and new cross sections. There's a vicinity map, and then having the existing and proposed features and structures. Now, sometimes this is kind of hard to get all this information in here. And a lot of times when we are looking at an engineering analysis and opening up all the maps and looking at all this, it can get kind of messy. There can be a lot of information on there, but Young does a good job of looking at these and making sure that all the information is on there. Do you have anything you want to add, Young? Okay.
No, I think it's the most of the time we don't see the certifications and the contour labels. So I mean, like we need to see clear, like elevation label on the map so we can actually verify those against the models.
So as I continue on, Young, if there's something you want to add, because you're the guru, you're the brains in the operation, just feel free to chime in.
Sure.
Cross-section plots. So cross-section plots of all cross-sections within the project boundary. There should be features, structures, and changes should be labeled. There's grid squares or elevation should also be noted on the cross-sections. Property survey is one of my favorite songs. It should be signed, sealed, delivered with the vertical datum. Again, stuff should be signed and sealed. A lot of times when we see property surveys, there's no vertical datum on them. So again, when we get this information, we sit down and kind of look at it and go, hey, it's missing this, missing that. So again, should be signed and sealed. No rise certification. A lot of times we get this no rise certification and they'll put the project name in there. And as you can see from the yellow highlighted text, it will not increase the base flood elevations or floodway elevations or impact the floodway widths on the name of the stream at the published cross sections in the flood insurance study for the community, the data of the flood insurance rate maps, and will not increase base flood elevations or floodway elevations or impact the floodway widths at an unpublished cross sections in the area of the proposed development. So I think what's important about this is a lot of times we get a lot of arguments about, well, I don't, there's increases for the base flood elevations, there are increases for the floodway elevations, there's an impact with the floodway widths. But a lot of times the engineers just sign this to say that there's no rise or no changes, but actually when they're signing the certification document, it's saying that there's no increase in the base flood elevation, floodway elevations, floodway widths at published or unpublished cross sections in the flood insurance study for the community. So again, that's kind of important to see that that can be an issue sometimes. So again, like when we sit down and look at all this stuff, we had someone a couple weeks ago that signed a no rise certification, or the community official signed a no rise certification, but the engineer said that it was in the floodplain. So I've got to sit down and call that community sometime this week and go, is it in the floodplain? Is it in the floodway? Which is it? Because if you're signing off on this, it is important that that is noted. So what is a no rise? So this is actually one of my Christmas ornaments at home. I love this. I've had this for a long time. But you guys always hear me joke that every year at Christmas, I always want a horse and I always want a no rise, right? So this year I think I've been a good girl, but now whether Santa will hook me up, I don't know. But it's looking at effective versus duplicate effective versus corrected effective, existing and proposed conditions. Everything has to align. The stars have to align, and you have to achieve a 0.00. So it has to go even to 100th. So if you have a 0.01, guess what? You have to do a conditional letter map revision because you did not achieve a no rise. So it's not one of those things where you can say, well, hey, hey, Aim, let's just round it down. No, if you can't achieve this, it's not considered a no rise. I love this picture because it reminds me of me. I just found it online arbitrarily. But what happens if you don't achieve a no rise? So again, if all that doesn't align, the applicant has to submit a conditional letter of map revision prior to the commencement of any development activity, and it has to be approved by FEMA. So sometimes we have people say, well, hey, Amy, I'm just going to submit that CLOM, or just go ahead and give me the permit. And so we always have to say, no, you have to get that conditional letter of map revision approval letter from FEMA to state that what what the project engineer submitted complies with the National Flood Insurance Program requirements. And then within 6 months of construction, the project engineer has to submit a letter of map revision to FEMA to update the flood insurance rate maps and the flood insurance study. So this is what it looks like when you get a conditional letter of map revision approval. It is a letter from FEMA commenting on whether the proposed project, if built as proposed, or proposed hydrology changes would meet the minimum NFIP standards. So again, this is an example of one. I just kind of erase any project location, community information, but this is what it looks like. So before you can issue that permit for the encroachment of a stream, you've got to have this approval letter from FEMA. So letter of map revision, it is a letter from FEMA officially revising the current National Flood Insurance Program map to show changes to floodplains, regulatory floodways, or flood elevations. And then the Code of Federal Regulations has different sections that require this. So this is some of the information that we got from one of the communities here. So these are the standards for 4465.12. I'm not going to necessarily read all these, but again, it does require a revision of a flood insurance rate map to reflect base flood elevations caused by proposed encroachments. And again, having a fee, an evaluation of alternatives, having a legal notice, again, having concurrence from the chief executive officer, certification that no structures are located in areas which would be impacted by the increased base flood elevations, and then request for revision, floodway revision, and then having a receipt and all that. So these are the standards here. This isn't something that I came up with or y'all come up with, but this is in the Code of Federal Regulations. As we talked about before, unmapped streams continue to be an issue. 65.8, that the community could require a conditional letter of map revision for a proposed project on an unmapped stream. And we would review the existing and proposed conditions analysis and comment on the impacts that the project would have on the proposed floodplain. So again, you can, as a local community, if you're getting pushed back about unmapped streams, this is, as a community, you do have the right to require that they submit it to FEMA as a conditional letter of map revision. You can submit it to my office to have it reviewed for compliance. If it is compliant, we do send a concurrence letter. So this is a concurrence letter that I sent to Ben Nimick a couple years ago. So again, these concurrence letters come from me. So they're for Zone AE without floodways, Zone A or unmapped streams, and the project is within the 1 foot rise. The project engineer and a local community can receive this concurrence letter from me. I would be remiss if I said this. Sometimes engineers will say that I've approved things and I haven't written a letter. So again, I'm the only one that can talk for me. So if you have a question or you have an engineer saying, oh, Amy's okay with it, please reach out. I've had that a lot lately. I just had a local floodplain administrator write a letter stating that I wanted someone to move off their property. So I got an angry phone call from a citizen. I never got a copy of the letter. I don't know what was said exactly. But again, if you have questions or you need assistance, please reach out to me. More than happy. Young's more than happy to talk about the status of a project. But again, if you're having us review it, until you get that concurrence letter, you cannot issue a development permit. If you do, that's going to cause problems, and you don't want to do that. So the MT2 forms, FEMA. So up here on this little link, there's a live link where you can click for engineers for all letter of map revisions, conditional letter of map revisions, or if there's a physical map revision. There's various forms here on the left-hand side that an engineer has to download. So you have the overview and concurrence where the local floodplain administrator will sign off on it. Form 2 has the riverine hydrology and hydraulics. Form 3 has the riverine structures. And then some of this other stuff coastal we don't have, but I just wanted to put it on there so you guys can see what that looks like. So we do have a no-rise checklist. So Young, I'll let you talk a little bit more. So Young kind of has, he's a guru of this when he reviews engineering analysis. So sometimes I'll sit down and kind of look at submittal and say it's missing this, that, and the other. And then whenever he gets a package, he does the reviews for compliance. So he really knows it inside and out. I know it enough to be dangerous. And then he also does an initial inventory. So on the checklist, one of the things that we do is we look to see what the flooding source is, the effective flood insurance rate map, the location, project name and description, and then the HEC-RAS model version. So this is just the initial inventory. So when he's looking at it, he kind of marks off, are these various elements received, right? So a lot of times we get the project narrative, we get a report, but we're missing a topographic work map or survey. And then when he's looking at a work map, he's looking to see if it's certified. Is there vertical datum? Are there cross sections? Are there effective delineations, revised delineations? Are there tie-ins? Is there a stream center line? Clearly labeled topo map? And is there a scale and north arrow? Is there anything you want to add to that, Young?
I think that's good enough. Yeah, I mean, a lot of times, like there's some of the missing element on topographic work maps, so we have to back and forth a lot on these items for sure.
And then also looking at executable hydraulic models. So again, if engineer is getting the effective model from FEMA, did he or she duplicate it on their computer? Is there any kind of corrected effective model? So again, that's non-man-made changes, and a lot of times the most common that we have for corrected effective is importing LiDAR into the modeling, and then existing and proposed conditions model. So again, what's existing within the project study area and what's being proposed. So again, statement on the source of the topographic data, what did you use? Proposed plans is assigned and sealed, certified, cross-section plots. Is there a no-rise certification form? Is that certified and stamped? And then effective information is a correct effective information for the flood insurance study, flood insurance rate map within the documentation. And is there an annotated firm? It's not required, but it is appreciated just to see visually and schematically where it's at along a flood insurance rate map.
Yeah, I add those because if you are submitting the MT2, like CLOMAR and LOMAR cases, this is a requirement. So that's why I add them.
Okay. So again, sometimes we've been criticized about what we require for a review, but we actually requiring the same thing that an applicant would submit to FEMA through the MT2 process. So a lot of times if we're looking at a study and they have to submit a conditional letter map revision, everything that we've asked for is what an engineer is going to be submitting to FEMA. Okay. So we're going to talk about common problems, successes, and opportunities, right? Because sometimes with floodplain management, I know a lot of you guys think, oh, I wish I wasn't a floodplain administrator. Oh, it's so difficult. Oh, right. But we don't ever focus really on the success, right? Because you guys are really on the front line when there's a development happening in your community to make sure that the development is in compliance with your regulations, that you're trying to minimize flood risk in your community. And again, you really are the star of the show because you're the point person to be able to give general technical assistance as far as looking at flood insurance rate maps, discussing the standards, discussing flood insurance to various stakeholders. So you touch a lot of lives, whether you know it or not, being a floodplain administrator and looking at development proposals. So we're going to talk about some of the common problems we see. We're even going to have like a little discussion about success and opportunities in the future for this. So we're going to kind of go through the top 10 common problems. And we're going to give an example of a FEMA additional data request. sometimes we have engineers that say, I don't want to have TEMA review it. I just want to have the local community review it. And so we have an example where a local community received an engineering analysis and they made the engineer submit to FEMA. And then you can see all the list of errors, quite a bit. And then we're also going to talk about success because even though this job is hard, it's difficult a lot of days, we are starting to see some success in some areas of floodplain management. I think probably the biggest blessing that I had was on January 29th when Julius come into my life and decided to take on Tennessee and work with me on floodplain management. He's my brother for life. He's just been a tremendous blessing. So some of you guys, we have Monday office hours that we talk to various communities about various issues. And I know there's some of you guys on the webinar today that you've had the opportunity to have Julius and I together and talk about various issues. So again, that's a success. And then also having Yang do these engineering reviews, because if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have tried to get compliance on a lot of projects. We wouldn't have had the education and outreach that we have. So some of you guys that have had him review a case for your community, if you haven't ever taken the time to say thank you, you know, Thanksgiving is coming up. So just take a moment today or this week and just send him an email and say, thanks, Yang, for helping the community. Because without him, we wouldn't be able to do this program. Okay, Yang, do you want to take it from here?
Sure. So you guys all know the David Letterman, right? He's famous for the top 10 list, and we're basically come up with the top 10 common problem that we see while I review this no-rise cases. And you know, like I like to go through some of these the examples. So first thing, you know, like that we saw a lot is the project narrative has a lack of information regarding the project. So we received the project narrative, but we cannot really figure out what's going on, what they want to do for the development. So I mean, a lot of times, you know, like we have to send it back to the requester, you know, to revise the project narrative in that cases. And you know, like again, Amy actually shows the notarized checklist, and a lot of times, you know, like submittal is not complete. There's a lot of missing required items, so we have to send it back those. And third one is, you know, like certification is missing, like topographic work maps, cross-section plot, design plan, proposed plan. Those require certifications, and you know, sometimes those are missing. And next big ticket item is the topographic work map. Need to show the proposed layer tied into the effective SFH layers at downstream and upstream limits. And you know, like a lot of times they only shows the streamlines and then you know, like contour lines and that's it. So I mean, like we cannot really tell where's the, you know, proposed boundary versus where's the effective boundaries. So those has to be all shown on this topographic work maps. And number 5 is the model result table in the report don't match with the actual model result. And you know, like there's several cases that I review. There's a, you know, like a result table on the report, and when I actually take a, you know, like look at it against the actual model result, they don't align with each other. Next slide. And then, you know, like I think there's a several questions regarding the, you know, like the model you know, like being difficult to tie into the effective studies because it's so far away from the effective study. So I mean, FEMA allows, you know, like truncated model in that cases, or you know, like if the effective model is not executable, they allow truncated model. That's why we always recommend, you know, like the engineers or requester to model their, you know, like streams further downstreams, so the boundary condition doesn't impacting the project area elevations. A lot of times they just started their model at the, you know, like project site, and you know, whatever they put it on the as a boundary condition, like for example, if they set it up like a 500 feet, like as a, like starting elevations, and that elevation doesn't change at the project site because they set up those boundary conditions that way. That's why we always recommend the engineer to extend their model further downstream, so those boundary condition doesn't impact the project area. And number 7 is the existing condition and proposed condition model cross-section don't line up with the effective model cross-section locations. So I mean, like this has, effective model shows the one cross-section locations, and their existing model is completely different from the effective model. They have the new cross-section location pretty much everywhere. So I mean, like we cannot really compare the elevation one-to-one. So that happened a lot in some of the cases. And next one is the all effective plan need to be included. So effective model has the, several plan, like for example, multi-profile plans and floodway plans. Then those, like additional plan need to be added in to your analysis as well. And number 9 is the design plan or proposed plan doesn't align with the model. So we have several cases, like design plan shows the, like certain, curve sizes, but, actual model, when we actually take a look at the model itself, they use a different model, like the curved openings in the model. So, I mean, that has to be aligned with the model, like the design plan and proposed plan, they need to align with the model. And number 10 is the, like most common issue that we see. They claim no rise solely based on the existing and proposed condition model result. We understand there's a no rise between the existing and proposed conditions, but again, like NFIP regulation require, like community to maintain the, like FEMA form, the form maps. So I mean, like all the elevation has to compare against the effective instead of just the existing and proposed condition model result. That's all, Amy.
Okay. So you guys can giggle. Cheyenne had never ever heard of David Letterman in the top 10 list, so that made me feel old. Okay. One thing, we get potential violation letters for various community development. So this is an example. So let's say, for instance, there's fill that's been placed within the regulatory floodway. The mayor will receive a letter, the floodplain administrator will receive a letter, the applicant that submitted the letter of map change to FEMA will receive a letter. I get a letter, Julius will get a letter, but we get potential violation letters. So beyond all the fun stuff that Julius and I do every day, one of the things that we have to try to work with communities when there's a potential violation. So this is an example where it says we have determined that fill has been placed on the property, portions of which lie within the regulatory floodway adopted by your community. And then it talks about in 60.3 D3, no encroachment may take place within a regulatory floodway if the encroachment would cause an increase in the BFBs. Therefore, the placement of fill on the property may be a violation of the regulations. So sometimes I'm sure some of you guys wonder, well, why is Amy doing this? Why is this so important? It's our number one violation that we have in Tennessee is that we have different kind of stream encroachments going on where there's not an engineering analysis being done. And so if a community signs off, let's say on a letter of map provision based upon fill to FEMA, and there's fill that's within the floodway, if I'm the mayor, I'm probably going to ask you, why did you sign off on this? If we have a call about a potential violation, we're going to ask you, did you have a site plan? Was a floodplain, floodway delineated on the map? What do you have for documentation? So essentially, even though some of you guys may not agree with this, we're trying to keep the community from receiving potential violation letters and having issues that maybe start out like a snowflake and then go down the mountain and become an avalanche. So we want to make sure that communities are compliant and that development is not causing increases in the base flood elevation, floodway width, or the base flood discharge.
Hey, Amy, this is Julius. Could you go back to one slide, please?
Sure.
Great job so far. Thank you, Young. Yeah, so this is what Amy is alluding to, the communication, community-led violation. So once it goes out, you see that name, Jason Hunter. He's my branch chief for floodplain management insurance branch. So he will get a notice, and then because I'm the lead for the state of Tennessee, it goes to me as well as Miss Tammy Henson. She is our Loma violation point of contact. So she will be coordinated with the community and say, hey, we have received this violation notice from FEMA headquarters. There's a violation in the community because someone encroached in the floodway or they built this house below the base flood elevation. And then we'll have a meeting with you to discuss the violation. She will reach out to you, schedule the time to talk about it, CC Amy and I so that we have visibility because she's a state NFIP coordinator and me being the lead specialist. And the community has to resolve this violation. So you have to bring that development into full compliance. So everything that Amy and I have been trying to do for the past year now is trying to take a proactive approach to ensuring that communities don't have violations. So if Amy doing the unfunded review of the engineering analysis for local communities is to ensure that you don't get that violation notice, because once you get a violation notice, FEMA has documented. We have a new NVT, which is a national violation tracker, where we are tracking violations now. So for the first time, FEMA does have a system where we're tracking violations all across all 22,000 NFIP communities. And if a property is listed on that violation tracker, they do not get off that tracker. So that's why it's so important to kind of be proactive. So that's why Amy and I are trying to have meetings. We have office hours on Mondays to sit down with you, sit down with an applicant, and to go over all the requirements to ensure things are done correctly so we could minimize violations. Will violations happen? Yes, it's just how life is. But if we could minimize it, that's what Amy and I are really trying to do. So when we ask you guys to be on the call with us is in order to have one voice. The local, state, and federal, everyone is speaking the same language. Everyone is understanding the requirements, and we're managing expectations from the beginning of the project until that project is finalized. So that way we could minimize violations for the community. So it may be daunting, it may be scary, and it may seem like it's extra, but the extraness of it is due to minimize the violations for communities. Just want to put that plug in.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. And so Julius, one of his favorite sayings is the same, manage expectations. So I'm sure you heard me giggle when you say that, because we're trying to manage expectations because everybody wants everything now, and just trying to manage expectations as far as these reviews, doing webinars, having Monday morning office hours. So some of you guys on the webinar today probably are giggling because you've had calls with us. And we just try to work to try to bring things into compliance. And it's kind of an open dialogue. It's kind of a safe place that if you're struggling with something and you need help, we're here to help you. But if you don't tell us, we can't help you. So just want to put a plug in for that. So again, this is just a letter. Oh, so this is a summary of additional data required to support a conditional letter map revision. So some of you guys may say, well, Amy, this is so extra. I just don't want to do it, right? Or if you say, you know what, I've had a couple communities say, you know what, don't really want to go through you. I want to go through somebody else to review these. And there's danger in that if they don't understand the program, or if your community and say, we're just going to have everybody submit it to FEMA to make sure it's compliant. So there's one engineering firm, won't name names, that doesn't like to go through reviews here, tries to bob and weave. So the local community said, okay, you have to submit the engineering analysis to FEMA as a conditional letter map revision because there's increases. So sometimes you guys say, well, Young's extra, Amy's extra, Julius is extra. But as you can see, we're asking for the same thing that FEMA is asking, and the engineer, okay, right? So we have number one here, that the Endangered Species Act compliance information wasn't submitted. Hydraulic models, again, did they request the effective model from FEMA? What's the duplicate model based upon? Again, Young was talking about having a profile with a multiple profile plan. So again, whenever someone's doing an engineering analysis, it has to have the 10, 50, 100, and 500 year flood levels in that. So again, it has to be a multi-profile plan. You can't just, we've seen engineering analysis where they just look at water surface elevations and call it a day. That's not comparing apples to apples, and that's not using the baseline that FEMA has established for doing an engineering analysis. So again, sometimes cross sections where he's talking about how floodway surcharges are over a foot, it cannot exceed over 1 foot minimum. Has to be less than that. Again, submitted plans don't have the vertical datum. So when you looked at the checklist a few moments ago, again, we're making sure that all these things are on there. It may seem extra, but if you're going to submit it to FEMA and you don't have it, they're going to catch it as well. And then making sure that you have model tie-ins to the effective flood elevations, contours. Young talked about that. Having a north arrow, a topographic work map. All these different things here. So again, making sure, because a lot of times you guys will, Young looks at top widths to make sure that the proposed and model and the cross sections below match, and sometimes they don't, model versus a plan. And then again, kind of looking at whether or not there's alternatives that would not result in any increase. So that's kind of everything. So sometimes you guys say, well, you know, Young submits a review documentation. There's a lot of stuff in it, right? But we're doing the same sort of review that FEMA does, and we're saving you guys money because by grant, I allocate money to do these in-house reviews because, again, it is an unfunded mandate. So, and then once a community or once an engineer gets this letter from FEMA, they have 90 days to resubmit the documentation. If they don't do it within 90 days, then the applicant gets hit with another application fee, which could be $9,000 plus. So again, I'm kind of saving people some money, which I always think is a good thing. All right. So success stories. We have had some projects that are in Zone AE without floodway, Zone A and unmapped streams that have met the NFIP requirement. So we have been able to, you guys saw earlier, a concurrence letter that we were able to write. That's always a good feeling to make sure that a project is compliant, because if you're the local floodplain administrator and you get, let's say, a property owner that's nearby a proposed development, let's say a major subdivision is going in and there's a bridge that's crossing a stream. A lot of times you get citizens, homeowners, residents that don't like proposed development going in an area. But if you have that concurrence letter to say that it's been reviewed, it meets the NFIP requirements, it's not going to cause increased flooding, or if there's a little bit of increases in things, the flood insurance rate maps are going to be revised to actively reflect what's going on in community. That's important because I get calls all the time, like you guys could hear my phone ringing while I was talking earlier. I get I'm the citizen hotline that if somebody sees something going on, I don't know how they find my name and number, but a lot of people call me questioning about various projects. Is it compliant? Is there documentation? So on and so forth. So if you have that concurrence letter on file, if the mayor gets a call, you have confidence to say, yes, we submitted it to TEMA. Yes, it's been reviewed. Yes, it's compliant. You can also send a copy of that letter to a homeowner to say, yes, it's compliant with the NFIP regulations. And so we're kind of giving you backup in case there's an issue or a question that you can say confidently it's compliant. And that's what we want for every single development across the state. So Roger Lindsay, would you like to talk about Metro's involvement, coordination with Young on review and engineering analysis?
Sure. I guess from a community perspective, I've had a number of submittals of applications for loamers or clomers, and I get stuck on the MT2 form under the community concurrence blank, where it says, and I quote, "As the community official responsible for floodplain management, I hereby acknowledge that we have received and reviewed this letter of map provision or conditional letter of loamer request. Based on the community's review, we find the completed or proposed project meets or is designed to meet all the community floodplain management requirements, including the requirements for when fill is placed in the regulatory floodway, and that all necessary permits have been obtained." And And so I've signed off on those on occasions. There's no provision in this box on the MT2 form that allows me to condition my approval or my concurrence. I'm essentially saying, as it's being submitted to FEMA, that it's a complete and correct and accurate package. And then when I find out 2 months later that there's a 3 to 5 page comment letter that came back on the package that is grossly incomplete or erroneous, or that's an embarrassment to me. Should be a horrendous embarrassment to the consultant that submitted it. So we've kind of taken the approach that we would like to see the package go through Young's review. And when Young says, okay, you got all the pieces and parts, and it does in fact conclude that it's a good, thorough, accurate submittal, then I'll sign the MT2 form, because then I have the confidence of knowing that it indeed is a package that should kind of go through the FEMA review process with a minimum of angst and tearing of hair and things like that. So that's kind of become our approach. I mean, too often I've reviewed a consultant's conclusion that he has no rise, just to find out that, you know, a 3 to 5 page comment letter doesn't really substantiate that conclusion. So that's kind of where we are with it.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
So that's just an example. Some of you that are on the call, I saw a couple of you guys that, and I know you're like, don't call me Amy. And so I can't see the attendance list, or I would. If I could, I would. But some of you guys, we have helped with various projects and stuff and kind of taken the lead. So we're here to support you. We're here to be your advocate, not your adversary. But again, as you can see, the little cheerleader down here at the bottom, compliance is way, right? We want things to be compliant. We want every single community to have an administrative procedure to make sure that things are being done appropriately. The days of fake it till you make it doesn't really work for floodplain management, because if something happens and you didn't do a thorough review, it can leave the community up for lawsuits and other problems that you don't want. So again, I think it's also one of the opportunities that we have is to just have increased awareness of the flood damage prevention regulations, because a lot of times, a lot of communities were not following these standards, we're not following this procedure. So as we continue to move forward in time, we're going to continue to do education and outreach on this and working with the engineering community to make sure that submittals get better over time. It's going to be a painful process. It has been a painful process, will continue to be a painful process for quite some time, I'm sure. But we want to make sure that we do it correctly. So again, just want to thank Yang so much. And I want to thank Julius for his support as well, because this job is hard sometimes. And when you're one person trying to help the whole entire state, it can be daunting. But it's good when you have a team together that supports one another. So with that being said, some of the local floodplain administrators on the call today would appreciate your support. When we have meetings with the project engineer or with the homeowner or whomever, we would appreciate your attendance. We would also appreciate, some of you guys are as quiet as church mice when we're on calls, but sometimes it would be nice if you guys would say, yes, we need to uphold the regulations and support us. We're not trying to do something beyond our scope of work or activities or authority. We're just trying to make sure that things are compliant. So again, the national flood insurance regulations are set by FEMA. Again, we're just doing what is within the Code of Federal Regulations. And I would encourage everybody to familiarize yourself with floodway and encroachment standards. These YouTube videos, you can always go back and watch them. If you have additional staff that was unable to attend today, please make sure that you tell them that this was a great webinar, hint, hint, and that they should watch the video once it's uploaded a little bit later today. We do provide a free service to review encroachments for compliance. Right now, we're trying to determine whether or not we're going to have a position or if we're going to have a contractual position to help do engineering reviews. I know that one of the biggest complaints that we have is or not as fast as what I would like to be on reviews, just because of the sheer volume. And then when some of the submittals are incomplete, instead of having like a piece of cheddar cheese, we have a piece of Swiss cheese, and there's various holes missing of documentation. So we want to try to, in 2023, have better submittals so that all the I's are dotted, T's are crossed. Again, community involvement and support is vital, because no person is an island. You guys really lean on me for general technical assistance, Julius as well. You lean on Young for doing reviews, but we also need you guys to support us. Seriously. And you want to make sure that we have complete submittals to expedite reviews. And then we also are going to be having coordination meetings for potential projects and concerns. So we have started to have meetings with communities when they're proposing a project. Sometimes, let's say it's an unmapped stream or it's a Zone A stream. How exactly do you do an engineering analysis? What does that look like? We do have meetings with the project engineer, with the property owner, and then what we would like to see is greater attendance from the local floodplain administrators. Because again, I know like the mantra has always been just let Amy handle it. But if you're the local official, you need to be aware of what's going on, because again, we want to equip you. It's kind of like a muscle. If you don't use it, you lose it. So if you do have proposed development in your community, we do want you to be on calls. Same thing for floodplain management. As we continue to get various inquiries for technical assistance, we are going to be asking the floodplain administrators to be on the calls, or if we have Monday office hours, that you be present. Because just for the sheer volume of requests that I get, Julius would laugh because he says Amy works a lot over hours trying to get stuff done. So we want to make sure that you guys are key players, because really you are the star of the show. So we thank you for your time and attendance today, and I guess we'll open it up for questions. Do we have any questions?
There were several questions. We tried to answer pretty much all those questions. So, I mean, if you guys have any further clarification, let us know.
All right. I want to thank Julius. I can't thank him enough for just being amazing and helping. If you guys have questions afterwards, you can email me, you can email Young, you can email Julius. Is there anything that you want to say, Julius, as parting words?
No, I mean, we appreciate you guys being on this training monthly webinars. I mean, definitely, I've been here about a year now, so I think Amy is the only, state in entire FEMA Region 4 that offers this monthly webinar. So I definitely kudos to Amy for all the hard work she does behind the scenes. She is doing a great job. It is a tough job, especially